Good morning, and welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program Seminar Series. I'm Victoria Budson, the Executive Director here. And as many of you know, the work here at our center focuses on closing gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, education, and health. And we look at those gender gaps within countries. Today we have a phenomenal presentation from the World Bank. Rita Hamalo is here with us today to talk about the new report. She's the program manager for the Enterprise and Analysis Unit. And the report focuses on women, business, and the law. And in addition, she manages all of the enterprise surveys. And these surveys focus on women as employees and entrepreneurs. And we're so pleased that she's going to come and share this new data with us. She is not a stranger in any way to Cambridge in our area. She received her PhD in economics from MIT. So welcome back. Sorry it is such an awfully rainy day. Our session, as is often the case, will be videotaped and placed on our YouTube channel here at Harvard so that you can share this information with your friends and beyond our walls here. Would you prefer to take questions as you go or at the end?
As I go.
Okay. And we always have a rigorous number of questions and good discussion. We look forward to those questions today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rita. Thank you.
So I'm here to present on this new project from the World Bank. It's actually a joint World Bank IFC project. IFC is the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And this, I think, would be useful for this group because it does link with the gender gap on the economic aspect, not on the political or health or education, but specifically on economic aspects. So why does this project exist? So I don't know how much you are familiar with another World Bank publication called Doing Business that measures business regulations across the world and how easy it is to start a business, how easy it is to employ workers, and looks at different regulations and how that affects the private sector development in a country. And from that work, it was realized that there isn't really a gender component in that work because it looks mainly at commercial laws, commercial regulations, and that those types of regulations tend to be gender neutral. But then on the other hand, you do see in practice there's less women in the workforce in the private sector. Globally, there's less women also being entrepreneurs than men. So you want to understand, does regulation does regulation play a role in that? So this is, a first attempt at trying to shed some light on the regulatory aspects and how they differentiate between men and women in women's ability to enter the private sector, both as employers or as employees. So basically, we measure gender differentiations in the law across 141 economies. We call it economies as opposed to countries because we include places like Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the US, so that's, and Hong Kong, which is part of China, for instance, so that's why we call it economies. And this is a second edition of this data set. This is an extended data set compared to the first one, and it was just launched a couple of weeks ago at the end of September. So this is just, again, a bit of a motivation for why we do this. This is just a set of examples of what type of restrictions can actually prevent or make it harder for women to participate in the private sector. So there's a lot of restrictions that restrict the autonomy of a woman, so she needs permission from her husband or her guardian to do a lot of transactions. And I'll go into more specific examples throughout the presentation. The head of household requirements are also an issue because it limits access to certain public services. So you may not be able to put your kids to school unless you have the husband's signature in the form and things like that, and as being head of the household. Another interesting, important issue when looking at regulations is to compare married and unmarried women. So normally there's more restrictions for married women than unmarried women, and I'll explain later on. Also in a few economies, not that many, there are explicit differentiations on the tax law. So women actually, by law, are supposed to pay more taxes than men, which to me was somewhat surprising, but there are still a few where for the same work, women actually have to pay some more taxes, and there's several economies that also restrict the inheritance rights of women compared to men, and also evidentiary rules. And I'll go into more details about the data. And why do we care? Besides just the basic fact that, in principle, restricting women's rights compared to men may not be a good idea. I think that's more or less, in most places, that's more or less accepted. I think there's also economic implications besides the implications directly for the women. There's also, in terms of family welfare, there's a lot of research that shows that, where women are more economically empowered, that tends to have better benefits for the children, for their health, their education, in the household. Also, having restrictions on access to finance, which a lot of this legal restrictions relate to having being less able to sign contracts and then have access to finance, can also prevent women from increasing their income and participating both in the labor force and as entrepreneurs. So I'll just, the presentation first, I'll just talk a bit about the methodology, the different areas that we cover, and then I'll talk about the main results. So we basically cover 6 topics, 6 areas. So the data set, there's a report and a data set that are intertwined. So the reports, several copies are there for you to take. And so we cover 6 particular areas. The reason why we cover these areas first, because we're looking at areas that link the law, gender, and business. So basically the private sector aspect, laws and restrictions in the law, differentiation in the law that can prevent or can potentially also make it easier for women to participate in the workforce. So that's why we chose this 6 areas. Not all of them are actually about explicit legal differentiation. So for instance, building credit is not, and I'll go into more detail when I talk about each of them. And as you'll also see later, a lot of these areas also link directly to rights of women as prescribed in CEDAW, which is the Convention on Equality, against discrimination on equality and against discrimination of women. So the first topic, which is accessing institutions, and I would present it more as being the really basic rights that a woman would have, and most places people would think that this should be, there's no discussion that this should be equal between men and women. Things like ability to sign a contract, to be able to travel outside of the home, for instance, to get a passport. And even also beyond those types of transactions, also how does the Constitution treat women? Is there equality prescribed in the Constitution? And how the customary law, which customary law tends, it's the normal, what we define here as customary law is the laws that relate to social norms and customs that are normally assigned to different ethnical groups. So this is very common in places like Africa, where different ethnical groups have different customary laws, and in practice things happen according to customary law and not necessarily the codified law. So also the treatment of customary law in Constitution is quite important for women's rights. And as an important issue in this topic, as in any of the other topics, we always look at the law as it is written and not as it is implemented. So this, in practice, what this means is that the differences that we find in the law, they probably do happen in practice, but there might be countries that are equal according to the law, but in practice they could be quite unequal, and we don't look at that as of yet. We may look at it in future editions. That's something we're trying to grapple with, of how to measure it, but as of now we don't look at it. Just to give you an example of the type of things we cover in accessing institutions, and this is like an interactive slide, so it may take me a while to get all the things. So, for instance, one of the restrictions we look at is to be able to travel outside the home. Fortunately, I think there's only 4 economies where this is, at least in the law, constrained, but there are 4 economies where you can, like, the type of economies is things like Yemen, where a woman cannot legally travel outside of the home. She needs the husband or a guardian to be able to step outside of her home. Then also to travel outside of the country, there's also half a dozen that limit that, and also to get a passport. You need also permission to get a passport. You cannot just go to a government institution and get a passport. Then also confer citizenship to their children. Why is this relevant for economic participation? The reason why it's relevant is because if the kids don't have citizenship, they would not be able in several countries to access public school, public health services, so the woman is less likely to be able to participate in the workforce because she has to stay at home with the kids. And so a woman in several countries cannot confer citizenship the same way as the father of the kids. And then another option is like another type of restriction that we look at is in several countries also women cannot legally choose where to live. Like it's the husband, and this affects mainly married women, it's the husband that legally has the right to choose where the family lives, and they cannot be head of household. Another one, which then is more like as we go along, these are more related, more obviously related to private sector participation. So to be able to sign a contract, open a bank account, and these things, for instance, the ability to sign a contract, you may think, okay, but that could be, if you're married, the husband cannot also sign a contract without the woman's consent. We only count here when there's no reciprocity. So it affects the woman, but not the man. If it affects both, we wouldn't count it as a restriction because it's equal. The law is gender neutral. And in several countries, there's also the issue of to get a job without permission, it's not feasible. You have to have permission from your husband, and the husband can, for instance, in Congo, the husband can actually go to your employer, to the wife's employer, and say, no, I don't want her to work, so fire her, and has the right to do that. So, and also to register a business. So these are the types of restrictions that we measure in this topic, and these are the results we find. Basically. So the good news is that 93 of the 141 economies that we measure don't have any types of restrictions that I described. But there's still 48 that do. They are concentrated basically in a few regions. So where it's more common is what we call MENA region in the World Bank, which is Northern Africa and the Middle East. So in those countries, there's in all of the 14 economies that we cover of that region, there's at least one search restriction of this type. Then in South Asia also, South Asia is basically the subcontinent, and there only Sri Lanka doesn't have these types of restrictions. So India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan have this type of restrictions. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we cover 35 economies, and 25 of them also have this type of restrictions. So this is where they are more common. And even out of the 10 that don't have restrictions in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not clear-cut because there's, as I mentioned before, there's the customary law that normally tends to be less beneficial or tends to be less equal for women, and several of this, at least one of these 10 countries, Zambia, does allow customary law to trump the non-discrimination in the Constitution. So it's legal for customary law to discriminate against women in Zambia. So there's all this. Then I think not surprisingly in OECD countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, at least on the law, there's equality in these different areas. There are 2 exceptions in Latin America and Caribbean, which is just a few unusual issues, and there's a few also, 3 in East Asia and Pacific. Then the other topic that we look at is using property. So this is basically about being able to manage, own property, inherit property. And here we also look at the default marital regime in the country, and this is very important in the sense that that defines the property rights for married women. So without knowing that, we won't be able to assess really what are the rights for women. And so basically, the results here, there's more equality, because normally what happens is that, so for unmarried women, there's really no difference between unmarried women and unmarried men in the property aspect. So normally it tends to be equal, except for inheritance. And inheritance, so there's 26 economies that differentiate between men and women, and that happens both for married and unmarried. But in terms of being able to own, use, and sell property, use it for collateral, for instance, there's only 7 economies actually that restrict that. So in most cases, basically, as people get married, both the husband and the wife need to, when they enter to any property contract, they need consent from the other party. But as I said before, as long as it's reciprocal, we don't actually look at it as being unequal, because it's, or as being a restriction, because it applies both to men and women. It's only when it applies only to women. And so I just put the 2 examples, and I chose these 2, Ecuador and Chile, because they are actually, to me, they were surprising. So I wasn't expecting this to happen. There's other, so that there are restrictions in sub-Saharan Africa. Places like the 2 Congos, you would expect more, because there's. It's known that women's rights there are not well upheld. But in places like Chile, it does sound surprisingly, but it does happen that in Chile, it's the man that manages the marital property, and the woman doesn't have rights over the marital property. So then this is just a map of the marital property regime. So basically, a lot of these are technical legal aspects, so I don't know how much you're interested in knowing about this. But the idea of having a map is just to show the regional trends. And you see that in most of Latin America, it's partial community of property. And this basically means that once people get married, whatever they earn after they get married is jointly shared by both. But whatever they had before is of separate property. And the full community of property would include both. And that's a very rare regime, actually, would include even the stuff that people had before they got married. The other very common regime is separation of property, which means, like whatever is the husband, whatever is the wife's is the wife's. And then there's other regimes like the US, where it's, for instance, it's mainly separation of property, but then the judge can decide on alimony, and they count for non-monetary contributions to the marriage. So even though on the law it's separation, in practice it becomes more partial community of property, because you actually share the income that was earned during the marriage. So this is just to show you a few of the dark blue is deferred or partial community of property, and that means that, so during the marriage, it is separation of property. So whatever is the husband, whatever is the wife. So the husband can sell his property without ever consulting the wife, and the wife can do the same. But at the time of divorce, the property is as if it was under partial community. So whatever was bought and earned, the income that was earned during the marriage, then becomes joint ownership of both. And so when they decide how to divide that, they would take.
Light blue is Islamic?
No, light blue is separation of property, which is common in Northern Africa and Middle East. That's true. And white is no data, so because we only cover 141 economies, so there's a few that we don't have data for. Okay. So the other topic, and this is, now we're starting to get into topics where maybe differentiation in the law may not be necessarily a bad thing or may be justified, is getting a job. So in getting a job, we basically look at labor regulations and how labor regulation, like we focus on areas of labor regulation that affect women's ability to get a job or to run a business. So for instance, we look at restrictions on women's work, both in hours and industry. So there are several places where you cannot actually work in certain industries, or women cannot work at night. So trying to assess that. We also look at maternity, paternity, and parental leaves, and that's where inequality across the world is very common. So a lot of almost everybody has maternity leave, but less than half of the countries, I think, have paternity leave. So here inequality is quite common. Also retirement ages, and so the first few are basically about inequality in the law or differentiations in the law. The last bullet point is more things that are somewhat related to affirmative action, even though we don't measure affirmative action, but they're closer to it. So things like equal pay for equal work, legislation, things on sexual harassment. So it's not necessarily affirmative action, but it's more not on things that does the law differentiate between men and women, but does it give women more protection? Yes.
What is the average retirement age of some of these economies?
So it's funny, so it tends to be higher for higher income levels. So richer countries tend to have higher retirement ages. The lowest is 50, and the highest is like 65. So it all goes from 50 to 65. We look at both actually retirement ages and pensionable ages. So retirement is basically when you're supposed to retire and get your benefits, and pensionable, in some places it's exactly the same as retirement ages. In other, it's a lower age where you can start getting benefits, even if they're partial benefits. They're not the full.
Did you also look at the retirement age differences for men and women?
Yes. Yeah, so we look at both for men and for women. And it's so basically in all countries, and I think I have that in the next slide. So in all cases, the retirement age in all countries, it's equal. It's either equal to men and women, or it's lower for women than for men. And so, and there, even though it's designed to be a benefit or a protection for women, it can prevent women, or can lower their income during retirement because they retire early, they have less savings, they're less likely to have a higher wage when they retire because they've worked less years. So even though it's designed as a protection, in practice it may actually make it harder, make life harder for women. So actually there are, the font is quite small, so I don't know if you can read it all, but no, I've realized I should have increased the font. So I think one important thing here, compared to the other two topics where differentiation, at least in the law, was somewhat rare, or was, there was some differentiation, but it's not the majority of countries. Here, all countries have laws that are different for men and women, and some of them are giving benefits to women, but every country has something that differentiates between men and women in the labor code. So maybe I think the only exception actually may be, no, but still has the equal pay for equal. I was going to say that the US may be the exception, but still because they have equal pay for equal work type of laws and things like that, and that tends to talk about both men and women. But anyway, so I was talking before about the working hour restrictions, and so those, and the industry restrictions, those are very common differentiations. So, and those affect both low-income, high-income countries. So there's all spectrums. All types of countries have this type of restriction. So the working hours is things like women cannot work at night or after certain hours, and working in they cannot. So 71 economies restrict being able to work in certain industries like mining, and for instance. And so again, these are rules that are designed to protect women, but they may limit women's ability to get higher income jobs. Then on maternity leave, as you probably know, the U.S. doesn't cover, or doesn't, at least federally, doesn't have paid maternity leave, only has unpaid maternity leave, and that's one of the three countries or the three economies out of the 141 that we cover that have this. So it's only so the U.S. is on par with Lesotho and Papua New Guinea. But on the plus side is actually probably the only, or one of the few countries that it's actually completely gender neutral on their regulations, because they talk about parental leave. They don't so the rules are, you have the 3 months of unpaid leave, both the father and the mother. So in that way, they are progressive because, yes.
I have a question. So looking at the 3 months of parental leave, do you mean as codified in the Family and Medical Leave Act?
Yeah, so we're looking at the federal one, and I'll ask Christina if you remember which was the law that was the source of that.
Yes, I think you're correct, and it's the passage is for different family matters, and it can be for sickness, of a family member, for birth, for death. So it's
one of the interesting things about the Family and Medical Leave Act, which we refer to as FMLA, is it is only required for companies with
50 or more employees.
So it's sort of interesting, though, on some level gender neutral. Like many pieces of regulation in the United States, it leaves out very large swaths of employees.
Yeah, that's true. And so we basically, we assumed because we have behind every question we have a set of assumptions, and so we assume that the employees, both the man and the woman, work in firms that are large enough. So I think they would have more than 50 employees, so then they would count that. And another question that I'm actually not discussing here, but we also cover it, is it legal to fire a pregnant woman, for instance? And in the U.S., again, it's only if you have, I think, 50, again, if I'm not wrong, 50 employees or more. So if you have less than 50 employees, or I'm not sure if it was 50 or if it was a lower bound for that particular one. But there is a minimum number of employees that you have to have for it to be illegal to fire a pregnant woman. If you have less, it's actually legal to fire a pregnant woman.
Well, I think you can't legally fire a woman because she's pregnant.
Yeah, you cannot. But
non-performance. But it's not by definition a protected
Yeah,
class.
exactly. So there are a few countries where those types of rules are binding, actually. I think there aren't that many, but there are a few where the size of the firm does matter for which rules apply. But we're trying, in all countries, we go for the more, like the highest benefit. Yes?
I'm just curious, for the countries that offer paternity leave, do you have data on the percentage of new fathers who actually take the paternity leave?
No, we don't. But I think that's a very good question. And so our aim here is more to provide just the data on the legal sources, but that's the type of research that we'd like to see being done. And my guess would be that it's not as high as the mothers, although they are. There are a few countries, so Sweden and actually Portugal also, where I'm from, that have restrictions on, or not restrictions, but they impose minimum paternity leave taken or parental leave taken by the father, so that the mother can take more time. So the law itself has some rules to actually increase the father leave, the leave taken by the father. But it will be good to actually see how much it's actually taken. And those are fairly recent changes in the law, so that in the past 5 years or so it would be good to see if it actually had an impact in practice.
You might not know, but I'm just curious now, because I knew about Sweden, but didn't know about Portugal.
Yeah, Portugal is fairly...
maybe you know, because you are there. How did it come about?
So there was, I think it was 2006, if I'm not mistaken, there was a change in the labor code, and they, and they decided to make it more progressive. I think there is also an EU directive toward, so they don't impose having parental leave, but they indicate that as being the preferred option. And so there's a lot of European countries going towards parental leave more than, and providing more rules for it. So they increased, so in Portugal they basically increased the maternity leave, and at the same time as they increased it, they transformed it into parental leave. So actually now in Portugal there's no maternity and no paternity leave, there's only parental leave, which is shared by both. And there's a minimum number of days for women, a minimum number of days for men. The minimum number of days for women is actually higher than the minimum number of days for men, but if the man takes all the days, then the woman can take more. So part of it is 100% paid, part is 80% paid, so they can choose how long they want to do and match it with the payment. Then let's see, on the retirement age, as we were talking about, so 50, we were talking before, 52 economies have lower retirement age for women than for men, and no economy does the other way around. The equal pay for equal work laws are the type of provision there are very, very common. So 128 economies out of the 141 have it. So, but in practice, it's really like the question is the implementation of these laws. And yes.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. Just going back one
yeah.
you missed my hand before. Is there any data, either by you or anyone else that you're aware of, that looks at the relationship between a change from maternity to parental leave? I know 2006 is kind of soon, so maybe not. On productivity in general in the economy, and then also on unemployment of women, so the employment rate.
So on productivity in general, I haven't seen that. Like, I was thinking more in, there's a paper referring to Germany where they had, the result was more, like that more men took parental leave, and but like that was more shared between the two, but I don't think they went all the way to talk about productivity. So they just looked at the immediate effect as opposed to making the jump towards productivity and employment for women. So I'm not aware of that.
I'm just a partial answer to your question that might also be of interest to you. So as part of the Women in Public Policy programs of closing the Gender Gap Initiative, we're working with the Center for International Development here at Harvard and Ricardo Hausman, and what they have done is to take a measurement that was collected by the World Economic Forum on women's workforce participation, or the gender gap in workforce participation, and they're now trying to have a longitudinal study and map it with household data and try to understand dynamics in the size of the gap and how that might be over time, and how that might be related to laws such as this one in Portugal, but other changes that you're collecting here. So, I mean, it's a huge job to to work with these different data sets and kind of match it all and try to see whether you can explain any changes in those trends. But I think we'll see some very interesting work coming out in the next few years on that very question.
As a follow-up, though, is there any plan to link that then to how particular economies form in the global economy? So, right, there's a sort of issue of gender,
right,
and what happens within a certain economy. But then there's also the issue of then how competitive or not competitive that.
Right.
So,
and that's actually quite easy to do. So, for example, there's a competitiveness index that the Web collects, but there's lots of data that the World Bank collects, or just growth data, or per capita income. So I don't think that's going to be the major hurdle there, to really try to link to inequality, all kinds of other data that we might be collecting on these countries. I think the bigger question really has been to open this black box here, which you're opening, and trying to look at differential treatment of men and women and collecting that data.
And in addition to that, I just like, it's not an answer to your question, but may even create more questions. But another thing that we're also doing in parallel and related to this project is to actually try to build an historical data set. Because so now we only have 2 years of data, because this is the second data. But because we're all based on the law, like, so all the indicators, all the information is based on the law. So we can go back in time and try to figure out what law existed before the current one and see when it changed. So we did it for a few countries. So mainly for the accessing institutions and the using property, we did it for 30 countries. And for the labor aspect, I think was just half a dozen of them. But we want to expand that. And we haven't put it on our website, but we'll put it soon, within the next week or so. Because we want to do some research ourselves with it, but we also want to put it out there so people can look at it and hopefully also come up with the answers to our questions of when you change these laws, what actually happens. Yes.
Backtrack a little bit. I was at a workshop around global youth employment and all those issues, and one of the gentlemen talked about resistances to girls entering the workforce, and then he sort of backtracked a little bit. What were those resistances? The question was asked, and he ended up saying, oh, well, when girls work, that changes the whole family dynamics, and they're proud of the girl. And I thought there was something missing in that answer, because I know there are resistances, and I'm wondering if, you know, are there people at the bank that are looking at those resistances on a, you know, on a kind of a micro level, of what are those resistances and what can change those resistances, and for the girls entering the workforce.
So I don't, like, there is an adolescent girls initiative within the World Bank, which doesn't necessarily look just at workforce, but it looks at, you know, access to health, education. So it's a broader aspect, not just being able to join the workforce. I'm not sure if they look specifically at, you know, resistance to that, but more from my experience and just in disseminating this project and talking to people about this data, the restriction tends to be, okay, the reason why there are this gender differentiated rules comes from religion, from social norms, and you'll never be able to change that. And like, so there's that type of attitude. And that's actually in part one of the reasons why we started also looking at the historical data. So it has two purposes. One is to understand more the impact of this and a research purpose, but the other one is also to show that a lot of the countries that are equal now were unequal not so long ago, had the type of rules that a lot of the unequal countries have it. So one of the examples we like to cite is Spain, that until 30 years ago, actually married women legally were minors. So they were treated the same way as a child. So until they had a new family code and civil code in 1981, you know, women did not have a lot of, like, they couldn't sign a contract on their own. They couldn't do a lot of restrictions, because this comes from the, you know, the previous regime with Franco, where it was very, like, the role of the woman was very stay at home with the kids. So female participation in labor force was very low, and it was frowned upon. So it was not something that women were supposed to do, to work outside the house. And now in Spain it's very common. It's like widely accepted. And that was a change that happened in the past 30 years. So I think that, in a way, we try to use those examples to other countries to see, you know, like, it's not something that was never done or unusual or that hard to do. We just need to push for it. I don't know if I have anything else on this slide now that got sidetracked. And is there any other question regarding to this? So I can. Oh, sorry, you had a question. Yes.
This is just an overarching question. California introduced paid family leave at the beginning of the last decade, or the beginning of this decade, and they, 2002. There's a lot of studies coming out now around the impact on productivity and worker retention and male maternity leave. But one of the other things that they've looked at is the type of women who take advantage of it, and it tends to be the more affluent women in sort of the private sector career track, and the lower income women who would benefit most from it don't know about it. And so there's the legal right, and then there's awareness of the right. And part of that awareness is cultural norms and whether the information is actually breaking through those cultural norms. And I'm curious whether you're also looking not just at the legislative policy, but to awareness and understanding of women within the communities and what they actually have rights and access to.
So in terms of the data set, we only look at the law and not of how information is disseminated. But that's one of the projects we want to work on going forward, is to actually understand that of countries that have changed their laws, and I'll go into a few of those soon. And there actually try to see, are people aware of the change in the laws, and see if, you know, if information campaigns could be useful for that, or so link it to more what we call the operational work of the World Bank, and trying to also work on disseminating the information about what rights they have. Because I think, I was surprised that in the US that would be the case, but I think in a lot of low-income countries that's more common, because access to information is more restricted, just, you know, because people have less resources to actually, you know, people don't have computers and internet to actually just get the information. But that's something we would like to do going forward. So the other topic, which is somewhat related to labor, is providing incentives to work. So this is a relatively new topic. It looks at tax liability. So basically, are tax regulations different for men and women? And there are a few where they are. Some benefit women, some benefit men, actually. And also, we try to look at public provision of childcare in education. So, being that one of the impediments for women to participate is because the traditional role of women taking care of the kids. And so, if there's no childcare available, women are less likely to participate. So that's our assumption to look at this data. So basically, there's only 9 economies that differentiate on taxes, and basically 5 of them make women pay more taxes, and 4 of them make women pay less taxes than men. So there are deductions for working women that don't exist for working men. And so one of the examples is Singapore, another is Korea, another is Spain, and there's another one that I don't remember now, where actually women getting the same income as a man, women pay less taxes because they have a special deduction for them. And there's 5 countries which is the other way around. So countries like Burkina Faso, Indonesia, also that's the case, where men pay less taxes than women. In terms of childcare, we also look at if it's tax deductible, and that's a relatively unusual provision in the tax code. Only 15 economies have it, so U.S. is one of them, and it's a high income economy type of provision in the legislation. And then in terms of the child care and education prior to primary education, that's more common. And so here, there's 93 economies that do provide this type of service, but here we include, it's a very broad category, so we would include things like pre-K would also count as, and there are several places where pre-K, so it doesn't have to be from birth until you enter primary education, as long as there's one public provision or subsidized that type of service, then we would count it here. That's why it's such a high number of countries that have that. And then primary schooling is mandatory by law. In most countries, there's only 8 economies, and there's low-income economies, and we're actually surprised why don't they have it. But and in most places, it's actually provided for free, the mandatory schooling. And then the building credit topic, that is actually a topic that it's not about gender differentiation in the law at all, but it's looking at the types of institutions that one would expect can favor women more than men, or can make it easier for women than for men. So what we look is, do credit bureaus actually get information from microfinance institutions? Because the vast majority of clients of microfinance are women. So the idea here is by the credit bureau getting that information, it increases the number of women they cover in their database more than men, so proportionally more than men, and making it easier for women to get a credit history. And therefore, then once they actually want to get a loan from a regular commercial bank, there is information on this woman, on her repayment schedules. And therefore, we would expect, this is an assumption behind it, and that's something we want to test too, but that women would then have more access to credit, or it would be easier for them to get a loan outside of the microfinance realm, so to help them graduate to a more commercial bank type of loans. And we also look at what is the minimum amount covered in the credit bureau. So, and then going to court again is it's a mixed topic, because it looks both at explicit differentiations and providing services, again, that may be more useful for women. So one of the things we look at on the explicit differentiation is, can women initiate legal proceedings the same way as a man? And that's true in all economies except one. So in DRC, so in the Democratic Republic of Congo, women cannot actually start legal proceedings without a husband's consent or a guardian consent. And the other thing we look at is, does the testimony of a woman carry the same weight as a man? And there are a few, 11 economies, sorry, I didn't remember the number, 11 economies, but that's not the case, where there's a different, so this affects, of course, the women's ability to use the court system. The other thing we also look at is the the existence of small claims courts. So the rationale behind it, or the assumption we're making here, is because if women are on average have a lower income on average, and small claims small claims court tend to target lower income people, then this type of service can benefit women more than men. And so that's why we measure this. But this is beneficial not just for men and not just for women, but in principle, lower income people that wouldn't have access to a more sophisticated court system or more expensive one. Then one of the reasons why we look at these topics, as I had hinted before, was how it links to human rights, and in particular with CEDAW. And so we just did a study of how the different topics link to the different articles in CEDAW, and we have a table, and the table is actually in the report. And basically, although we're looking at this more from an economic perspective than a legal one, even though it's a legal database, it actually has a lot of links to human rights. And so basically, mainly the economic rights aspects of things, more than, like, there are some that are the first level of human rights, but these are also the second generation. Most of it is second generation human rights aspects. And I'll go fast because probably I won't have much more time. Besides, so far I've only talked about the topic findings. Then I want to discuss a bit of the global findings, which you may have figured out already, some of them, because they're just the aggregation of the topic findings in a way. And so we look at different areas, in particular 45. So out of all the questions in the different topics, we isolate 45 key areas of differentiation between men and women. And in there's only 38 economies that actually don't have at least one legal differentiation. So there is a lot of inequality in the law still, although it varies a lot by type of inequality across different regions, and some are less, like in principle would have less of an impact on women's ability to participate in the workforce, but they still can have an impact in there. And of course, there are, this pie here just shows how it's the distribution in the number of differentiations. So there are 24 economies that have 10 or more differentiations, although most of them either have 0 or 1 to 3 differentiation. So there are several economies that don't have that many. And then in terms of the regional distribution, and we use the regional definitions of the World Bank, which some people may not be that familiar with, but anyway. So the Middle East and Northern Africa is the region where there's more differentiations, as we discussed before, and then South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So not just in the accessing institutions, as we discussed before, but across all topics. Those are the places where in the law there's more differentiation between men and women. And this is a bit more of detail on where the differences lie across the different regions. And basically in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and high-income countries from OECD members, the differences tend to be on things that are about benefiting women, even though in practice they may make it harder for women to participate in the workforce, but things like different retirement age, restrictions on what industries women can work in, but nothing about really the ability to sign a contract, open a bank account. That's not common there. Those things only really apply in Middle East and South Asian and Sub-Saharan Africa, most of them. And so there are different trends here, and I'll go faster so we can have more questions at the end. And then, as I hinted before, so because we have 2 years of data, we can see how countries have changed. And so these are the changes that reflect only the 2 years. So this doesn't reflect the historical data that I was talking about before. And so there we have 36 economies that did 46 changes, in legislation. And so some of them were what we call towards more gender parity, some were neutral, and some were away from gender parity. And so the only one that went away from gender parity was Bolivia, and what they did was basically they changed their retirement age, and they went from a retirement age that was gender neutral, so equal for men and women, to make it lower for women than for men. So so it became an unequal system. The neutral ones are basically changes in the legislation that affect the indicators, but still the difference, either the difference between men and women is maintained, or it didn't exist before, like in the case of Norway, and it still doesn't exist in the end. The more, the country that did most reforms and more overarching reforms was Kenya, and I'll explain in the next slide more in detail what they actually did. And basically, one of the things they did that led to all this reform was a constitutional reform that changed a lot of the rights that women have, at least in the law. And I think that's where, as we were discussing, the information campaign would be useful to see if women actually do become aware that they have these rights and make good use of these rights. And this the Kenya history is more about, like, it wasn't a reform to target gender equality, actually. It was more for political reasons, because they had election problems and a lot of civil unrest within the country, and that's why there was a constitutional reform, but they used that to move towards more gender equality. So this was done in 2010. And basically things like before, like they didn't have, the Kenyan women didn't have the same rights as men in terms of getting documents from the government, things like passports and stuff like that. Now they have the same rights. Married women did not have the same property rights as married men. Now they do. And they also didn't have the same rights when regards inheritance, and now they have the same rights regarding inheritance as before. And so a lot of rights that may have been applied in practice now are made stronger. And so, for instance, the freedom of movement in and out of Kenya for all citizens, even though there wasn't an explicit restriction before, the Constitution didn't have this provision giving that right. And it's important to also give that right, not just being about imposing restrictions on the law. And one thing that I had already discussed is that actually one of the interesting findings of the report is that women, as they get married, they lose rights, but not men. So we don't want to say that women should not get married. That's their choice. But in several countries, not in the U.S., but in several countries. So in 23, I think, yes, or 22 economies, there women don't have the same, married women don't have the same rights as unmarried women. They have less. Just because they got married, they lose a lot of their rights. And so the example is, for instance, that in 22 economies, women don't have the ability, married women don't have the ability to legally choose where to live. In 29, they're not able to be head of household. Only the husband can be. So there are several, and as I mentioned before, in 7 economies, there's different rules on property for married men and married women, while for unmarried women, there's no such restriction. So a lot of the restrictions come with marriage. Let me just see, and this was actually, I wanted to move this slide to earlier on, because this talks about, I don't know if you remember that slide where there was the little boxes where we talked about the different restrictions that women face, and this is just the distribution of that across regions, how many economies impose that restriction and by region. So you can see that there's none of these restrictions exist in Eastern Europe and Central Asia or in OECD member countries. It's only in the other 5 regions. And another interesting thing, and I don't think this is not new, there's other research that shows this, that basically, although there is a correlation between the number of differentiations and income levels, so being that higher countries with higher income level tend to have less differentiation for women, tend to have both in the law and also in outcomes, in that sense that women are more likely to participate in the workforce where there's higher income. It's still not a one-to-one effect or a one-to-one rule, in the sense that there's still a lot of high-income countries that have restrictions for women. So just by growing and increasing the income level, restrictions don't just disappear. So there is a policy agenda here that needs to be tackled in order to get towards equality in the law. So, and we just put a few examples of the types of the countries that have restrictions across the world that are considered as high-income economies, at least according to the World Bank rules. And then the last issue, but not the least, I hope. So the other thing, and this is, again, just a correlation, cross-country correlation, so very basic and needs further research to understand things. So basically from the World Bank data set, the World Development Indicators, we know that women represent almost 50% of the population, but only around 40% of the formal workforce. And so, and again, that's one of the reasons why we started this project, and we wanted to understand that. And there is a correlation between the number of differentiations and women's labor force participation, both in absolute terms, but in relative to men. So even in countries where both men and women are less likely to participate, you do see there is, so the gender gap in labor force participation can be partially explained by the number of legal differentiations. And this is controlling for income per capita already, so it's not just driven by the income level, or it's not driven by income level. But of course, the next step is trying to see the impact of reforms. Yes.
So as you've walked us through all of your data, and if you can just flip back to the last.
Oh, sorry.
As you've walked through all of our data, you're showing us a really terrific roadmap of these are the types of legal differentiations, and then how it impacts participation in the labor force. As I listen to that, what I'm also aware of is the gaps which were brought up between what is culturally known, and even though a woman can have full equal rights within a married situation, what we know is women rarely have full rights, even in high-income places, or equivalent bargaining power to make decisions in the household.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of, did you come across in your data collection information about what the slide looks like if instead of just looking at these legal differentiations, though it's beyond the scope of your project, what it looks like just, women in married situations versus single?
So we don't have that type of, and also because the labor force participation is just aggregate numbers, they don't differentiate between married and unmarried. So we don't have that particular type of data ourselves, but there is, I don't know if you're aware, but the new World Development Report that also came out last month on the 19th is on gender, so it's gender and development. And there they have, oh, okay, so good.
You have to hold my question.
No, there they have data that may partially answer your question. It's not exactly what you're asking, but one of the things they look at is, and there is a survey that has this type of data, and I don't remember exactly the source, but it's there in the report, where they look at the number of hours that women spend working in household tasks. And so there's still, that could be in a way measured in how much they spend outside, working for paid jobs outside of the house, and how much they spend in taking, taking care of children, elderly, doing basic household chores. And in all countries that they covered, they didn't cover many, I think it was 30 or so if I'm not mistaken, and all income levels, women do spend more time doing the household chores and taking care of children than men, and spend less hours in the working outside the house. And when you add up the total time, women do work more hours than men, like when you do the addition of inside the house, outside the house. Where it's more equal was like Nordic countries, where both the chair outside and inside the house were more equal, the number of hours that they spent. But there was always some marginal more on women than men. So that can, so one option would be to correlate that type of data with the number of differentiations that we have here. And that could, hopefully I haven't done it, but I would hope that it would show where there's more legal differentiation, the difference between, the number of hours that women work more inside the house versus outside, and compared to men, that there would be a significant correlation. But thank you.
So actually, I wanted to ask you about the impact, and you mentioned in your last statement, you want to look in the future about the impact of all these laws. I'm sure that there have been some work done in particular countries looking at one particular law, of this nature. But and this goes back also to what you just said about basically women, when you add up the work at home and the work outside the home. I mean, I just wonder if there's a way to kind of bring in the happiness research that has been done by Betsy Stevenson and people like that, who have tried to measure with surveys people's happiness and the impact of these changes on women's and men's happiness and welfare in general. Because, I mean, this kind of just reminds me of the Soviet Union, of how it used to be, equal, quote unquote, again, de jure, equality, and women, or pretty much labor force participation rate of women was quite high back then, but it's still in reality, women probably were very unhappy because the society basically dictated that women had to also do the house. Really, it was like a dual role, working on the job. And so actually, almost as a revealed preference, right after the transition, there was a mass exodus of women out of the labor force. And is that discrimination, or is that, true, some sort of the labor force participation rate was too high, given that women were still supposed to work at home. So, I mean, I think it would be interesting to look at these kind of welfare impacts, but also on these more qualitative, right, happiness. And I don't know, it's very difficult to measure,
So
obviously.
what we're thinking, for the historical data in particular of changing, seeing what was the impact of a reform, what we had in mind was linking it more to household surveys and see, women's bargaining power within the household. So that's what we're thinking of doing, but I think that's also a good option of looking at the happiness or that type of surveys, because our idea was it's not necessarily, women should work outside the house and let's increase females' labor force participation. Is more like women should have the opportunity to do so if they want to. But if they opt to do something else, that's also fine. It's their choice. It's just not, we want to limit the restrictions and increase the opportunities more.
You mentioned a few times throughout the course of the presentation that there are certain areas in which gender differentiation in the legal system actually helps women. So I was wondering, in terms of making policy recommendations and using this research to support that, what type of normative claims you're hoping to make off of the data that you found? I mean, is it rather that you want to see equality in, no gender differentiation in law, or to support the policy recommendations that actually have gender differentiation that occasionally supports women?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's both. So that depends on the topic. So some areas it's well accepted, at least in most countries, although there's a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of cultural and religious issues here. So things in, basic, for instance, inheritance rights is a very controversial thing. Having equal inheritance rights in the majority of the world, it's well accepted, no problem. But in the Arab world, it's not well accepted because it comes from religion that there's different inheritance rights for men and women. So there, I think, from the more economic perspective, and the normative prescription would be equal rights, but then there's a clash between religion and economic perspective. But I think on the inequality, on the issues where maybe inequality may be a good option, is what I had in mind. For instance, there was a study in Taiwan a few years ago where they looked at industry restrictions versus having maternity leave, and so there was a law that changed that, and so. And basically what they found was that having industry restrictions actually made women less likely to work because there's less industries that they can actually work and work hour restrictions. So that type of restrictions normally reduces labor force participation from women. But going from a situation where you have no maternity leave to having maternity leave, you actually increase women's labor force participation because now, if they get pregnant, they can still, they see it more feasible to actually continue working after maternity leave as opposed to before they would just drop out of the labor force. They were more likely to just leave the labor force. So it depends on, like, what is your objective. If the objective is to maximize labor force participation, then you can see which policy leads towards more labor force participation. And that's when I had in mind about different rules that are unequal can actually, things like maternity leave in particular, can actually lead to more labor force participation by women. But it all depends on what's your objective function in a way.
I just wondered in what ways the World Bank would use this information to leverage constructive change in the various societies. And obviously, this research is being done with purpose in that way. What are the most obvious?
So I think, so there's different objectives. One of them would be the awareness issue of like just letting people know what are the differentiations that exist out there. So provide the information. The other purpose is also, increase the research done in this area by providing this information. People can actually then go, not just ourselves, but people across the world can, different research institutions and universities can actually do the research. And then there's the more operational objective of actually dealing with what we call client countries, so the countries that the World Bank operates with, and actually inform change in that area and actually towards more equal rights. There the issue has, like the country itself would have to be interested in making these changes. So the World Bank can inform and give examples of how other countries have done it, of what could be the benefits of doing it. And I think that's where the research plays a role to show, like this is the benefits of changing these laws. But in particular, one of the areas that we're trying to work more is within the investment climate area, because that's where we are more about. We're about private sector development. And in there, actually, for instance, when the World Bank does a lot of this type of work of helping a country improve their business registry and how to make it easier for investors to set up a firm and to that way hopefully create more firms and more jobs and all of that. And so one of the ways we're using this data is to actually try to inform that reform work on how is this different for women. What would be the is the improving this business registry also going to help women or not? Are there legal restrictions that would prevent women from using this new service or this improved service? So that's how we're linking up with the operations. I don't know if that clarified your question.
I had a quick question about how this report came about, and I was wondering if you might be able to share with us a little bit behind some of the reasons for it to come out with it. I remember you saying this is your second set of data.
Yes.
And the first set, I think, was in 2009?
2010, in March 2010, so 1.5 years before.
I was curious if you could share with us a little bit of the background behind that, and also whether it had anything to do with the financial crisis.
No. So it wasn't related to financial crisis, and it came more from the fact that there is so it's a somewhat complicated history because there was an interest in actually, although we don't have a ranking, but there was an interest in the World Bank at some point in time in actually having a ranking more like the gender gap from the World Economic Forum, but more on the legal aspect. So as opposed to looking at the outcomes, looking at the policies that can potentially lead to those outcomes, of having a ranking on that. But and this was actually the initial idea was actually to make it part of the Doing Business report, and this would be one chapter or one indicator within Doing Business of saying, okay, so how business regulations affect women, how is it different for women? But then and then it would be incorporated into the whole Doing Business ranking. But then because of all the cultural and religious issues that are behind a lot of the norms, that the laws that exist, it wasn't feasible for the World Bank to have a ranking on this type of issues. Basically, that's how it boils down to. Saudi Arabia wouldn't like it. And so, and because the World Bank is, has all the different countries are the shareholders of the World Bank, so they have a say on certain things. And so because that's why we then became a separate thing from the Doing Business and just became a standalone. And actually, so there's, of course, the political reason why we are a standalone, but I think there's a more technical one, which I think it makes sense for us to be standalone because the type of laws that we cover are completely different from the set of laws that doing business looks at. That it's more commercial regulations, and ours is more personal law, family law, because that's where there's differentiation. The commercial regulations tend to be gender neutral, so so it would be a bit of, even though it may make sense from an outside perspective, from a legal perspective, it would be a bit actually a forced marriage. It wouldn't be a natural one.
I just wanted to applaud you for doing this. I think we're all feeling a bit like, why haven't we been doing this for 20 years? But then, now we can actually understand some of those correlations that you just showed us better in a longitudinal framework, and we're all not satisfied, about the outcome variables. Could we have better ones in welfare, and we're not happy with the income, the input variables, as in bargaining power in the household and implementation of laws versus written laws. But I just wanted to, building on your question, kind of draw our attention to the fact that it's taken us so long, to start with this, and that's really, really crucial. I mean, that's just the first step, and unfortunately, we need now 10 years of data to, say anything about what works, what doesn't work, and what's the relative impact of changing X versus Y, and things like that. But at least this is the beginning, and so I'm very excited about this.
Okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. Rita Hamalo, thank you so much for joining us from the World Bank.